Alright, a few words about the yext API. You can go directly to the link, or maybe better, go to the workshop page, look for today's session, and you have the information here. So the link to the repository is served by this link, some more information, even a detail how to deploy a toy app that explores the yext API in your mobile platform. So let's get started. So let's start by looking at the repository that is behind the page being served here. There we are. So the instructions in the yext API documentation, which of course again you get them here. One of the resources in the API that may be worth exploring first is the location API. So you get more information here, how many entries you get each time, offset, and so on, and what fields you need. So it's all here. Again, linked from the workshop page for 12th of July 2017. And if you go through the yext API documentation, you find out that the API calls are not CORS enabled, and also they require an API key. These two things put together are really a suggestion that we should be using them within a proxy rather than expose them directly to an app. And that's what I did. So I created a proxy, which is the topic of this screencast. So let's see it in action. The first thing this proxy is going to do, or is going to require, is that you load a client-side object, there it is, that is going to operate the API of the proxy, and the proxy will operate the API of yext directly. And I wrote it in such a way that the method getJSON, just like in jQuery, using promises, will target the URL call to the API, where you leave the account ID and the API key attribute value pair with this pattern. The proxy will fill it for you, and then you have a function that makes a call. Before we make the call, let's quickly look at the index.html page I have here. Just for demonstration, of course, you don't need to load any of this. You just need to call the script. Nothing to see here. All the action is in the browser console. See, this is the repository where you can read more in the README file, just like we were doing. And the main thing is that at some point your HTML will load yext.js. So back to README. This is this part. Now let's have a quick look at the code. So the code starts by finding out if you already have yext defined as an object. If you do, it won't be destroyed, it just creates a new. Sorry, if you don't, so if type of yext is undefined, it creates it. Otherwise, it doesn't destroy it, it just creates a new method, jobs or attribute, which is left empty. And now you're guessing already that I used JSON-P mechanism to get around the CORS enablement. I wrote a function, getJSON, that will start with the URL of the proxy, defined here. This is a Google script, so it's a server-side script hosted by Google. And what I return is the promise, so promise, resolve, reject, where it starts by creating a script element, creates a unique identifier by add job plus data now string. So this is just a trick to create a unique string. And that unique string is then assigned as the identification of this script, which will be useful later on to remove it. Then we create the source. So the source is going to be the base URL of the proxy plus callback yext.jobs and then the UID. So the reason why this UID is created is really to create a job queue, and this job queue is going to be filled with the resolution of the promise. After the promise is resolved, there is a set timeout, and within a second the script is removed from the element. Sorry, the script is removed from the head of your HTML page. If there is an error, then the second function of the promise, reject, which is right here, will be ran and will return an error explaining which URL caused, or disclosing which URL caused this error. Going back to what happens after delete, you delete the job. After 1 second, You also go to the parent element of the script and remove the child. So asking the parent to remove the child is removing self. That's what happens here. All right, let's see this in action. See, it's a very small script, and you don't need to know any of this. You just need to load the script and use yext.getJSON as a promise. So let's see it in action. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go to that little page that we went over here. Nothing to see here, etc. Nothing to see here. Now I'm opening the developer tools and running the application. So notice here in the head, we are going to have the script edit resolving this promise, where of course the account ID and the API keys are filled by the proxy, and then deleted after 1 second. Here we go. See, create it and delete it. Again, one more. Delete it. That's it. And you have the object with the response here. I didn't specify the number of entries, so by default I get 10. So you get an example of 10 Stony Brook physicians with information about their clinical, their personal, and also their geographic information here. So all is all is set for you to write apps that explore the, I think, close to 1,000 entries in this database kept by Yext on behalf of Stony Brook. Let's see if we forgot anything else. So we went through this. Oh, the location API, Yext has a number of APIs. This is probably the most interesting to explore. So you can define how many entries you want. You can offset, so you can scan the entries of the database up to 50 at a time, and a lot of other information. So it's useful to know this API in some detail, such that your app doesn't have to download every single physician every time. We'll leave this to another screencast, but it's also a good idea to cache the answers, such that if your app asks for the same thing twice, it doesn't call for the same thing twice. Alright, so I think I'll stop here and we'll go through these other issues in another screencast. And finally, let's have a look at the toy application written to illustrate the use of the proxied yext API. So if you go to the GitHub page, the README page, you see this information at the end. It's called yext Jonas. So this is just a toy app, nothing too important. And it's also to illustrate for the newbies among you how you can write JavaScript that manipulates events listened from a DOM element. The yext API call, you get the string for the URL with the account ID and the API keys unspecified. So now I can make the call. There it is. The same information we've been looking at. And you can copy it, go to a new page, and make the call. So if you don't specify the callback, by default the callback function is called callback. If you specify the function, for instance, callback equals to la, notice that in the code we are doing exactly that with a UID, creating a unique job identifier. You get la as the callback function with the data passed as the sole input argument. Again, there's nothing here you really need to know to use Yext. This is just so you get some insight on how I wrote the proxy. Okay, let's go there quickly. There it is. How I wrote the promise that calls the proxy, and regardless of being JSON with padding or some other mechanism, it treats the get JSON as a promise, and it's no concern on the developer's part how this is done. Alright, and I think I covered everything I wanted to tell you from here. If you are in an Android device, I've tried already. It's if you add the app, this one yext Jonas, to your home screen, you get it as a native app that behaves as one taking the full screen. That's the screencast I got here. Alright, have some happy development. Bye now.